Sometimes a man thinks he's got nobody left in this world, that every bridge has been burned and every door has been shut. That's exactly how Caleb Vance felt when his own family cast him out over a bitter inheritance fight, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back. He won an old cabin in a poker game up near Devil's Ridge. The place had been empty for 30 years. When Caleb walked inside, he found a trunk full of old letters and toys. At the bottom was a worn Bible with his mother's name written inside. How did his mother's Bible end up in a cabin he'd never seen before? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air bit sharp against Caleb Vance's weathered cheek as he stood outside the ramshackle cabin, his mother's Bible clutched tight in his calloused hands. At 53, he'd learned to read the mountains like scripture. Every wind shift, every shadow, every warning the wilderness whispered. But this place, this forgotten corner of Devil's Ridge, spoke in a language he couldn't quite decipher. The cabin sagged under the weight of 3 decades' neglect. Its cedar shingles curled and blackened by countless mountain storms. Weeds had claimed the front steps, and the porch roof dipped like an old man's shoulders. Yet something about it felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream that tugs at you in the quiet hours before dawn. Caleb had been walking these mountains for nigh on 40 years, ever since his daddy first taught him to track deer through the aspen groves. Born and raised in the valley below, he knew every creek, every game trail, every hidden meadow where a man could find peace when the world grew too heavy. Or so he'd thought. This cabin, tucked away in a fold of pine and granite that seemed to hide from the sun, had somehow escaped his notice all these years. The poker game that brought him here felt like something out of a fever dream. Old Pete Hawkins, drunk on moonshine and bitterness, had slapped the deed on the table like it was cursed. "Take it," Pete had slurred, his eyes wild with something that might have been fear. "Been trying to get rid of that place for 20 years. Ain't nobody wants to live where the dead won't rest." But Caleb wasn't superstitious. He'd seen enough of life's real horrors, the slow death of his marriage, the bitter legal battle that tore his family apart, the cold shoulders of brothers and sisters who chose sides in a fight that never should have happened. Ghosts and curses seemed like gentle companions compared to the flesh-and-blood cruelties he'd endured. The inheritance fight had started simple enough. When his uncle Jeremiah passed, leaving behind a modest spread of land and a small fortune in timber rights, the family had gathered like vultures around carrion. Caleb, being the eldest nephew and the one who'd spent the most time helping Jeremiah in his final years, assumed he'd inherit the bulk of it. He'd earned it through sweat and loyalty, sitting by the old man's bedside during those long nights when the cancer ate away at him like acid. But blood, as Caleb learned, could run colder than mountain snow. His younger brother Marcus, always the smooth talker with his city lawyer friends, had somehow produced a will dated just weeks before Jeremiah's death. A will that left everything to him, with Caleb getting nothing but a rusty hunting knife and a box of old photographs. The legal battle stretched on for 2 bitter years, eating up what little savings Caleb had managed to scrape together from his work as a hunting guide. Lawyers' fees piled up like winter snow, and family dinners turned into cold wars, fought with sharp words and wounded silences. His sister Rebecca, who'd once brought him apple pie every Sunday after church, wouldn't even look at him in the grocery store. His youngest brother David, barely past 30 and still wet behind the ears, called him greedy and selfish in front of half the town at the annual harvest festival. When the judge finally ruled in Marcus's favor, Caleb felt something break inside him that he wasn't sure could ever be mended. It wasn't the money or the land, though losing both hurt like a physical blow. It was the realization that the people he'd loved most in this world could turn on him so completely, could believe him capable of the greed and manipulation they accused him of. His wife Sarah, not his mother Sarah, but the woman he'd married 23 years ago, had tried to stand by him at first. But as the legal bills mounted and the family drama consumed their lives, she grew distant, then resentful, then finally gone. She'd packed her things one cold February morning while he was out checking his trap lines, leaving only a note that said she couldn't watch him destroy himself over something that was never really his to begin with. That note had been the final nail in a coffin that was already built and waiting. Within a month, Caleb had sold their house to pay off the last of the legal debts, packed his few remaining possessions into his old pickup truck, and headed for the high country. He'd been living rough ever since, moving from one hunting camp to another, taking odd jobs when he could find them, slowly watching his savings dwindle like snow in spring. The Bible in his hands felt warm, despite the cold mountain air, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. He opened it carefully, afraid the brittle pages might crumble at his touch. There, in the front cover, written in his mother's careful script, were the words Sarah Vance, 1965. His mother had been barely 18 when she'd written that. Just a slip of a girl starting her life in these mountains. She died when Caleb was 12, taken by pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. He still remembered her voice reading to him from this very Bible, her gentle hands smoothing his hair when nightmares woke him in the dark hours before dawn. She'd been the anchor that kept their small family steady, the one who could make his father smile even after the hardest days in the timber woods. But how had her Bible ended up in this forgotten cabin? She'd been buried with her personal effects, or so Caleb had always believed. His father had never spoken much about her belongings after the funeral, too broken by grief to deal with such painful reminders. When his father remarried 3 years later, the new wife had cleaned house with the efficiency of someone trying to erase the past, and most of his mother's things had simply disappeared. Caleb stepped carefully onto the sagging porch, testing each board before putting his full weight on it. The front door hung slightly ajar, its hinges rusted and squealing like a wounded animal when he pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with a main room that must have been used for cooking and gathering, and what looked like 2 smaller rooms toward the back. Dust motes danced in the pale sunlight that filtered through grimy windows, and the air smelled of old wood, mouse droppings, and something else, something that reminded him of his mother's lavender soap. The trunk sat in the corner where he'd found it, still open, still holding its mysterious treasures. Besides the Bible, there were letters tied with faded ribbon, their envelopes yellowed with age. There were small wooden toys, a carved horse, a little wagon, a set of wooden blocks with letters painted on their sides. At the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in what looked like an old baby blanket, was a silver locket that Caleb recognized with a shock that nearly knocked him to his knees. His mother had worn that locket every day of his childhood. It had been his grandmother's, passed down from her mother before that, holding a tiny photograph of his great-grandfather who died in the Spanish-American War. When his mother was laid to rest, that locket had been around her neck, or so everyone had believed, but here it was, real as the mountain granite beneath his feet, warm to the touch as if it had been waiting for him all these years. He opened it with trembling fingers, and there was the tiny photograph, just as he remembered. A young soldier with serious eyes and his mother's gentle smile. The questions multiplied like rabbits in his mind. Why was his mother's Bible here? How had her locket ended up in this trunk? And who had been caring for this cabin all these years? Despite its run-down appearance, someone had clearly been maintaining it to some degree. The roof didn't leak, the floors were solid, and there was even a small stack of split firewood by the stone hearth. As the sun began to set behind the pine trees, painting the cabin's interior in shades of gold and amber, Caleb made a decision that would change everything. He was going to stay here, in this place that somehow held pieces of his mother's memory. He was going to find out why her belongings had ended up in this forgotten corner of the mountains. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find some answers to the questions that had been eating at him since the day his family turned their backs on him. Outside, the mountain wind picked up, whistling through the trees with a sound that might have been his mother's voice, calling him home. Caleb woke to the sound of footsteps on his front porch. He'd been living in the cabin for 3 days now, making do with his bedroll on the floor and cooking simple meals over the old stone hearth. The first 2 nights had been peaceful enough, filled with the familiar sounds of the mountain wilderness, owls calling through the darkness, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes echoing off the granite peaks. But this was different. These were deliberate footsteps, heavy and purposeful, circling the cabin like someone was taking inventory of the place. Caleb reached for the hunting rifle he kept beside his bedroll, his heart hammering against his ribs as the footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin, followed by a gruff voice that carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Open up in there. Sheriff's Department." Caleb set his rifle aside and pulled on his boots, running his hand through his graying hair before opening the door. Standing on his porch was a man he recognized, Deputy Frank Morrison, a solid, no-nonsense lawman who'd been keeping the peace in these mountains for the better part of 20 years. Behind him stood a younger deputy Caleb didn't know, his hand resting casually on the grip of his service weapon. "Morning, Caleb," Morrison said, his breath steaming in the cold mountain air. "Heard you've been staying up here at the old Harrow place." "It's my place now," Caleb replied, pulling the poker game deed from his shirt pocket. "Won it fair and square." Morrison examined the document with the careful attention of a man who'd seen his share of questionable paperwork. "Pete Hawkins, huh? Surprised that old drunk still had the deed to this place. Been trying to get rid of it for years." He handed the paper back to Caleb. "You know why? He mentioned something about it being haunted. Don't put much stock in ghost stories." The younger deputy snorted with amusement, but Morrison's expression remained serious. "Ain't ghosts you need to worry about up here, Caleb. It's the living that'll cause you trouble." Before Caleb could ask what he meant, Morrison continued. "Got a complaint yesterday from Marcus Vance. Says his brother's been trespassing on family property, making threats, causing trouble. Says you been stalking around his place at night, scaring his kids." The accusation hit Caleb like a physical blow. "That's a damned lie, Frank. I ain't been within 10 miles of Marcus's place since the court ruling. Been right here minding my own business." "I figured as much," Morrison said, his tone softening slightly. "Known you most of your life, Caleb. You ain't the type to go making trouble for children, no matter what bad blood exists between you and your brother. But Marcus, he's got friends in town now. Important friends who don't take kindly to what they call undesirable elements hanging around their neighborhood." The younger deputy stepped forward, his chest puffed up with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from wearing a badge for the first time. "Maybe it's time you moved on, old-timer. Plenty of other places in these mountains where a man can set up camp without bothering decent folk." Morrison shot his partner a warning look. "That's enough, Hayes. Man's got a legal right to be here." He turned back to Caleb. "But I gotta ask you something, and I need an honest answer. You been down in the valley at all since you moved up here?" "No, sir. Like I said, been right here the whole time." "Can anyone verify that?" Caleb almost laughed at the irony. 3 days ago, his isolation had felt like freedom. Now, it felt like a trap. "Ain't exactly been entertaining visitors, Frank. Just me and the mountains." Morrison nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. "Here's the thing, Caleb. Someone's been prowling around Marcus's place the last 2 nights. Security camera caught a figure moving through his backyard, peering in windows. Couldn't make out a face, but it was definitely a man. Tall and lean like you." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Caleb felt his temper rising, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help his situation, and Morrison was just doing his job. "You really think I'd sneak around my brother's house like some kind of common criminal, after everything that family's already put me through?" "No," Morrison said firmly. "I don't, but Marcus does. And he's filed an official complaint. That means I gotta investigate it proper, and that means I gotta ask you to come down to the station with me. Just to answer some questions, get your statement on record." The younger deputy's hand moved closer to his weapon. Course, you could make this difficult if you wanted to. Wouldn't recommend it, though. Caleb stared at the man for a long moment, recognizing the type. Young, eager, looking for any excuse to prove himself in a situation that called for nothing but patience and good sense. I'll come with you, Frank, but I'm telling you right now, whoever's been bothering Marcus, it ain't me. As Morrison nodded his appreciation for Caleb's cooperation, something caught the deputy's eye through the open cabin door. Hayes pushed past Caleb without invitation, his gaze fixed on the trunk in the corner where the letters and toys still lay scattered. Well now, Hayes said, picking up one of the wooden toys, a small carved horse that fit perfectly in the palm of his hand. Interesting collection you got here. These look old, real old. Put that down, Caleb said, his voice carrying a warning that made Morrison take a step closer to his partner. But Hayes was already reaching for the letters, his young face twisted with the kind of smug curiosity that had probably gotten him in trouble his whole life. These look like they might be worth something. Antiques, maybe. Question is, where'd you get them? I found them here when I arrived. Convenient story. Hayes untied the ribbon holding the letters together, despite Morrison's sharp command to leave them alone. As the bundle came apart, several of the letters scattered across the floor, their fragile pages separating from their envelopes. One letter, written in his mother's familiar handwriting, caught Caleb's eye as it fell. Even upside down, he could make out a few words. My dearest Thomas, and when the baby comes, and our secret place. The world seemed to tilt sideways as the implications hit him. His mother had been writing love letters to someone named Thomas, secret letters hidden away in this forgotten cabin, and she'd been pregnant when she wrote them. But Caleb had been her only child, or so he'd always believed. That's enough, Morrison barked, finally stepping in to restrain his overeager partner. You got no right to go through this man's personal property without a warrant. But the damage was done. As Hayes reluctantly stepped away from the trunk, Caleb knelt to gather the scattered letters, his hands shaking as he tried to process what he'd just seen. His mother, pregnant with a secret child. His mother meeting someone named Thomas in this hidden cabin. His mother living a life he'd never known existed. The questions that had been gnawing at him since he first found the trunk suddenly seemed like gentle whispers compared to the roar of confusion that filled his mind now. Who was Thomas? What had happened to the baby his mother had written about? And why had she kept this place, these letters, these memories, hidden from the world? We should go, Morrison said quietly, his voice gentler now that he'd seen the impact his partner's careless actions had on Caleb. Get this matter cleared up so you can get back to your business here. Caleb nodded numbly, carefully placing the letters back in their bundle and setting them gently in the trunk. As he locked the cabin door behind him and followed the deputies to their patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life, everything he thought he knew about his family, his mother, himself, was built on secrets that were only beginning to reveal themselves. The mountain wind picked up as they drove away from the cabin, whispering through the pine trees with a sound that now seemed less like comfort and more like a warning of storms yet to come. The sheriff's station smelled like burnt coffee and old paperwork, familiar scents that reminded Caleb of the few times in his life when he'd been on the wrong side of the law. Nothing serious, a bar fight in his 20s, a hunting license violation that got sorted out with a fine and a warning. But sitting in the hard wooden chair across from Morrison's desk, he felt like a man whose luck had finally run out. Coffee? Morrison offered, gesturing toward a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the previous century. I'm fine. Caleb's hands were still shaking slightly from what he'd seen in those letters, and he didn't trust himself to hold a cup steady. Morrison settled behind his desk with a heavy sigh, the kind that comes from dealing with family disputes and small-town drama for too many years. Look, Caleb, I'll be straight with you. This complaint from Marcus, it's got some folks stirred up. Your family's got influence in this town now, especially since Marcus married into the Whitman clan. The name hit Caleb like a cold slap. The Whitmans owned half the businesses in the valley, from the lumber mill to the hardware store to the bank that held most of the local mortgages. They were old money by mountain standards, the kind of family that could make life very difficult for someone they considered an enemy. "So that's what this is about," Caleb said. "Not justice, politics." "Justice and politics got a way of tangling together in a small town," Morrison admitted. "But that don't mean I ain't gonna do my job proper. Tell me about the last 3 days. Where you been, what you been doing, anyone who might have seen you." Caleb recounted his time at the cabin in careful detail, the mornings spent exploring the property, the afternoons fixing small repairs, the evenings reading by candlelight since the cabin had no electricity. It was a simple, solitary existence that had felt peaceful until this morning's rude awakening. "You said you've been reading," Morrison noted. "Reading what?" For a moment Caleb hesitated. The letters from his mother felt too private, too fragile, to share with anyone, even a man he'd known most of his life. But they might also be his only alibi if things got worse. "Found some old letters in the cabin, personal stuff, family history I never knew about." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Caleb's face with the careful attention of a man trained to spot lies. "Family history? What kind of family history?" "The kind that makes a man question everything he thought he knew about his people." Before Morrison could press for more details, Deputy Hayes burst through the door with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested he'd been practicing the entrance. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Morrison frowned at the interruption. "What is it, Hayes?" "Got a call from Marcus Vance. Says someone broke into his garage last night, went through his files, stole some old documents. Happened around midnight, same time his security system went down. The timing couldn't have been worse." Caleb had been at the cabin all night, alone with no one to verify his whereabouts. He could see the wheels turning in Hayes's mind, connecting dots that didn't actually connect but would look convincing on paper. "What kind of documents?" Morrison asked. "Family papers," he said. "Old deeds, birth certificates, that sort of thing. Real specific about what was missing, stuff related to their Uncle Jeremiah's estate." Caleb felt the trap closing around him. Someone was deliberately targeting Marcus, and the timing made it look like Caleb was seeking revenge for losing the inheritance battle. It was clever, calculated, and completely beyond his ability to disprove. "I need to make a phone call," Caleb said. Morrison nodded toward the phone on his desk. "Local calls only, but who could Caleb call?" His ex-wife had made it clear she wanted nothing more to do with him. His siblings had chosen Marcus's side in the family war. The few friends he'd had in town had gradually drifted away as the legal battle dragged on, uncomfortable with being caught in the middle of family drama. "Never mind," he said. "Ain't nobody to call anyway." The admission hung heavy in the small office, a reminder of just how isolated Caleb had become. Morrison's expression softened with something that might have been pity, which somehow felt worse than suspicion. "Caleb, I'm going to give you some free advice," Morrison said, leaning forward across his desk. "Whatever you found in those letters up at the cabin, family history or otherwise, you might want to think real careful about whether it's worth pursuing. Sometimes the past is better left buried." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means there's folks in this town got long memories and short tempers. Folks who might not take kindly to someone digging up old secrets, especially someone who's already caused them family trouble." Hayes stepped closer to Caleb's chair, his young face flushed with the excitement of what he probably thought was his first real investigation. "Maybe we should search that cabin of his, Sheriff. Could be he's hiding evidence up there. Could be planning more break-ins." "On what grounds?" Morrison asked sharply. "Suspicious circumstances. Pattern of behavior. He's got motive to go after his brother. And now someone's targeting Marcus's family documents, right after this guy moves into a cabin full of mysterious old papers." The logic was thin, but not completely unreasonable. Caleb could see Morrison considering it, weighing his personal knowledge of Caleb's character against the mounting circumstantial evidence and the political pressure that was clearly building behind the scenes. "I'll make you a deal," Caleb said before Morrison could make a decision he might regret. "Let me go back to the cabin tonight, but post a deputy outside if you want. That way you'll know exactly where I am if anything else happens to Marcus." Morrison considered this for a long moment. "Hayes, what do you think?" The younger deputy looked disappointed at being denied his search warrant, but nodded reluctantly. "Could work. Long as he don't try to slip out the back or nothing. I give you my word," Caleb said. "I'll stay put until this gets sorted out." As Morrison filled out the paperwork for what amounted to house arrest, Caleb's mind wandered back to the letters scattered across his cabin floor. His mother's handwriting, speaking of secrets and hidden places, and a baby that might have been his brother or sister. Someone named Thomas, who had shared her deepest confidences in that forgotten cabin in the mountains. The pieces of a puzzle were starting to take shape in his mind, but the picture they formed made no sense with the life he'd always believed his mother had lived. She'd been a simple mountain woman, devoted to her husband and son, faithful to her church and community. She hadn't been the type to keep secrets or maintain clandestine relationships in hidden cabins, or so he'd always thought. But then again, he'd also thought his family would never turn on him the way they had. He'd thought his wife would stand by him through hard times. He'd thought he knew who he was and where he belonged in this world. Maybe it was time to accept that most of what he thought he knew was nothing but the comfortable lies he'd been telling himself. For too many years, the deputy assigned to watch Caleb's cabin turned out to be Hayes, which felt like Morrison's way of giving the young man something to do while keeping him out of more serious trouble. Hayes had parked his patrol car at the base of the trail leading up to the cabin, close enough to monitor Caleb's movements, but far enough away to avoid having to make conversation. Caleb was grateful for the distance. The last thing he needed was an eager young lawman breathing down his neck while he tried to make sense of his mother's letters. He'd spent the afternoon carefully reading through each one, arranging them by date, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. The earliest letter was dated June 15th, 1964. His mother would have been 17 then, still living with her parents on their small farm down in the valley. The letter was addressed to "My dearest Thomas" and spoke of secret meetings at what she called "our place in the mountains." Even at 17, Sarah's handwriting had been careful and elegant, the product of a strict education that valued proper penmanship above almost everything else. "I counted the days until I could see you again," the first letter began. "Mama thinks I'm helping Mrs. Henderson with her garden work, but I dream of nothing but our walks through the pine trees and the way you read to me from your poetry books. You make the world seem larger than this small valley, full of possibilities I never dared imagine." The Thomas she wrote about was clearly educated, someone who owned poetry books and could open her eyes to a larger world. But who was he? Caleb had grown up hearing stories about everyone his mother had known during her youth. There'd been no mention of anyone named Thomas, no romantic relationships before she'd met and married his father. The second letter, dated 3 weeks later, contained the line that had caught his attention back at the sheriff's station, "When the baby comes." But reading it in full context made the situation even more confusing. "Thomas, my love, I know we agreed to wait until after the harvest to make our plans, but circumstances have changed. I went to see Doc Morrison this morning, and he confirmed what I suspected. When the baby comes in the spring, we'll need to be far from here. My father would kill us both if he knew, and your family would never accept a child born in such circumstances. The cabin you showed me last month, the one your grandfather built before, the mine closed, could be our sanctuary, until we can make a proper life somewhere else, Caleb." Read those lines 3 times before their implications fully sank in. His mother had been pregnant in the summer of 1964, which meant she'd given birth sometime in early 1965. But Caleb himself hadn't been born until 1971. 6 years later. So who was this earlier child? And what had happened to Thomas? The third letter provided part of the answer, though it raised even more questions. Dated October 1964, it was written in a shakier hand, as if his mother had been crying while she wrote it. "My beloved Thomas, I cannot believe you are gone. The mine accident took you so suddenly that I barely had time to say goodbye. Your family buried you in the town cemetery without even telling me about the service, as if our love meant nothing, as if the child I carry means nothing. I went to your mother's house yesterday to tell her about the baby, but she turned me away from the door. Said I was a shameless girl trying to trap her dead son with lies and accusations. Caleb set the letter down carefully, his hands trembling with more than just the evening cold. His mother had been in love with a man named Thomas, who died in a mine accident before their child was born. She'd been 17, pregnant, and completely alone, except for whatever refuge this hidden cabin had provided. The next few letters painted a picture of increasing desperation. His mother had hidden her pregnancy from her own family as long as possible, sneaking up to the cabin whenever she could, to prepare for a birth that would have to happen in secret. Thomas had left behind some supplies, blankets, basic medical materials, even some books that seemed to bring her comfort during the dark winter months, but it was the final letter that shattered everything Caleb thought he knew. About his family history, my precious daughter, it began. I write this on the day you came into this world, February 14th, 1965. You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, with your father's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. I have named you Grace, for the grace of God that brought you safely through the long winter in this mountain sanctuary. A daughter. His mother had given birth to a daughter 6 years before Caleb was born. A sister he'd never known existed. The letter continued with heartbreaking detail about the baby's first days of life, the struggle to keep them both warm and fed in the isolated cabin, the terrible decision that his mother had been forced to make. Tomorrow, I take you to the Catholic orphanage in Denver. Sister Margaret has promised to find you a good family, people who can give you the life I cannot provide at 17, with no husband and no means of support. She assures me that your new parents will love you as I do, and that perhaps someday, when I have made a proper life for myself, I might be able to find you again. The letter was signed, Your loving mother, Sarah, and dated February 18th, 1965. Caleb sat in the gathering darkness, staring at the letter until the words blurred together. Somewhere out there, he had a sister who would be 60 years old now, who might have children and grandchildren of her own, who might have spent her entire life wondering about the young woman who'd given birth to her in a hidden mountain cabin. But there was more. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in what he now realized was a baby blanket, was a small wooden rattle that someone had carved with infinite care and patience. The handle was worn smooth from use, and carved into its side were the initials G.T., Grace Thomas, presumably, named for both her father and the grace her mother had prayed would see them through the hard winter. As night settled over the mountains, Caleb understood why someone might be breaking into Marcus's house, searching for family documents. If Grace was still alive, if she was looking for information about her birth family, she would need access to records that might trace her back to Sarah Vance and the secret she'd carried to her grave. The question that remained was whether Grace was the one conducting the searches herself, or whether someone else had learned about her existence and was using that knowledge for their own purposes. Either way, Caleb realized his quiet investigation into his family's past had just become much more complicated and potentially dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Dawn came gray and cold to Devil's Ridge, with storm clouds gathering over the peaks like an omen of troubles yet to come. Caleb had spent most of the night staring at the carved wooden rattle, turning it over in his hands, while questions multiplied in his mind like sparks from a wind-blown fire. By morning, he'd made a decision that would either bring him closer to the truth or land him in more trouble than he could handle. He was going to find Grace. The sound of an engine laboring up the mountain trail interrupted his thoughts. Through the cabin's front window, he could see a second patrol car making its way toward Hayes's position at the bottom of the trail. This one was driven by Sheriff Morrison himself, and Caleb felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. Good news rarely arrived with the sheriff at dawn. 20 minutes later, Morrison was sitting across from him at the cabin's small wooden table. his weathered face grim with the kind of news that changes everything. "There was another break-in last night," Morrison said without preamble. "This time at the county clerk's office. Someone went through the birth records, death certificates, adoption files, everything from the 1960s. Professional job, too. Knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced his voice to stay steady. "And you think I had something to do with it?" "Your deputy watched me all night." "I never left this cabin," Morrison nodded. "Hayes confirms that. Which means either you got an accomplice or someone else is conducting their own investigation into your family's history." He gestured toward the trunk in the corner. "Mind if I take a closer look at what you found?" There was no point in refusing. Caleb had been expecting this moment since yesterday, and he'd already decided that honesty, or at least partial honesty, was his best strategy. He opened the trunk and carefully removed the letters, the baby blanket, and the carved rattle. Morrison read through the letters with the careful attention of a man trained to extract facts from emotional testimony. When he finished, he set them down gently and picked up the rattle, examining the carved initials with something that looked like recognition. "GT, he said quietly. "Grace Thomas. Well, I'll be damned. You know something about this." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. "My father was Doc Morrison back in those days. Delivered most of the babies in this valley for 40 years. He kept detailed records, even of the births that weren't exactly official. He delivered Grace. According to his private notes, yes. February 14th, 1965, in a cabin up near Devil's Ridge. Mother was Sarah Thompson. That was her maiden name. Father listed as Thomas Henley, deceased. Baby girl, healthy, 7 pounds 2 ounces. The confirmation hit Caleb like a physical blow. Grace was real. His sister was real, and somewhere out there in the world, she was searching for the truth about her birth just as desperately as he was. "What happened to Thomas Henley?" Caleb asked. "Mine accident, just like the letters say. Copper mine about 10 miles north of here. Killed 6 men when a support beam failed and brought down half a tunnel. Thomas was the youngest, barely 21. Smart kid, from what I heard. Had big dreams about going to college, maybe becoming a teacher or a writer. Your mother wasn't the only girl who was sweet on him." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Thing is, Caleb, if someone's been breaking into records offices looking for information about Grace, they probably found what they were looking for. Birth records, adoption papers, maybe even current contact information if she ever requested her original birth certificate. Which means what? Exactly. Means your sister might already know she has family in this valley. Question is, what's she planning to do about it?" Before Caleb could respond, his attention was caught by movement outside the cabin window. A figure was making its way up the trail, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew exactly where they were going. It was a woman, probably in her late 50s or early 60s, wearing a practical wool coat and hiking boots that had seen plenty of mountain trails. "Expecting company?" Morrison asked, following Caleb's gaze. "No," Caleb said, but even as he spoke the word, something deep in his chest was telling him otherwise. The woman's gait was familiar, the set of her shoulders, the way she held her head when she was concentrating on difficult terrain. He'd seen those mannerisms every morning for 12 years of his childhood. In the mirror that hung above the kitchen sink, the woman reached the cabin and knocked on the door with the same 3-rap pattern his mother had always used when she came to wake him for school. Morrison gestured for Caleb to answer it, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Caleb opened the door and found himself staring into eyes that were exactly the same shade of brown as his own, set in a face that looked like a feminine version of his mother at 60. The woman was tall and lean, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that bore the calluses of someone who worked for a living. "You must be Caleb," she said, her voice carrying the slight mountain accent that marked her as someone who'd grown up in these hills, even if she'd lived elsewhere since. "I'm Grace. I believe you've been reading my mother's letters." Behind her, At the bottom of the trail, Caleb could see Hayes standing beside his patrol car, looking confused and uncertain about whether he should intervene in what was clearly a family reunion that had been 60 years in the making. "Grace," Caleb said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "My God, you're really here. I've been looking for this place for 3 years," she said, stepping into the cabin without invitation. "Ever since I got my adoption records unsealed and learned my birth mother's name. Took me another year to track down the location of the cabin where I was born, and 6 months more to figure out that someone named Caleb Vance had recently taken possession of the property." She moved through the cabin like she belonged there, her eyes taking in every detail with the intensity of someone cataloguing memories they'd never actually lived. When she reached the trunk, she stopped and stared at the baby blanket and the carved rattle, as if they were religious relics. "I remember that rattle," she said softly. "Not consciously, but somewhere deep down, I remember the sound it made, the way it felt in my hands. Isn't that strange? Remembering something from when you were just a few days old?" Morrison cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Morrison. I need to ask you some questions about some recent break-ins in the area." Grace turned to face him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I imagine you do, Sheriff. But first, I think my brother and I have some catching up to do. Don't we, Caleb?" Sheriff Morrison's presence loomed over the cabin like a storm cloud, but Grace seemed completely unbothered by the implied accusation in his request for questioning. She settled into the wooden chair across from Caleb with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent years preparing for this moment. "I suppose you want to know about the break-ins," she said to Morrison. "The answer is yes. I was responsible for searching Marcus Vance's garage and the county clerk's office. I needed to verify certain information before approaching my brother here." Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. "And breaking and entering is a serious crime, regardless of your motivations." "I understand that, Sheriff. I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions, but I think you'll find the situation is more complicated than a simple case of criminal mischief." Grace reached into her coat pocket and produced a manila envelope thick with documents. "These are copies of everything I found during my searches, along with some additional materials you might find interesting." She spread the papers across the table between them. Birth certificates, adoption records, property deeds, and what looked like legal correspondence spanning several decades. At the center of the collection was a document that made Caleb's blood run cold. Uncle Jeremiah's original will, dated 20 years before his death, leaving everything to my nephew, Caleb Vance, and his sister, Grace Henley. "Children of my beloved sister, Sarah, where did you get this?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "From a safe deposit box that Jeremiah maintained in Denver," Grace replied. "A box that your brother Marcus has been trying to locate and access for the past 3 years, ever since he learned of its existence from Jeremiah's personal papers." Morrison studied the will with the careful attention of a man who'd seen his share of family disputes turn ugly. "This changes everything about the inheritance case. If this is legitimate, then the will that gave everything to Marcus was a forgery," Grace finished. "A very good forgery, created by someone with access to Jeremiah's signature and legal stationery, but a forgery nonetheless. I had it examined by a handwriting expert in Denver. The paper is correct. The ink composition matches other documents from the same period, but the signature was traced from genuine documents rather than written naturally." Caleb felt the world shifting beneath his feet once again. The inheritance fight that had torn his family apart, the legal battle that had cost him his marriage and his relationships with his siblings, had been based on a lie. Marcus hadn't just outmaneuvered him in court, he'd committed fraud on a massive scale. "Why didn't you come forward during the original court case?" Morrison asked. Grace's expression darkened. "Because I didn't know I had a brother named Caleb until 6 months ago. I've spent most of my adult life knowing only that my birth mother was named Sarah Thompson and that I was born in a cabin somewhere in the Colorado mountains. It wasn't until I hired a private investigator that I learned Sarah had married a man named Robert Vance and had a son in 1971. pointed to another document in the collection, a private investigator's report that detailed not just Caleb's existence, but the entire inheritance dispute, the family rift, and his current circumstances. Reading his life story reduced to a series of cold facts and timeline entries was a sobering experience. By the time I learned about the inheritance case, it was already over, Grace continued. But I also learned that Marcus had been actively searching for any record of Jeremiah's mention of a sister named Grace. He'd hired his own investigators, accessed sealed adoption records through questionable means, and had been systematically trying to eliminate any evidence that might challenge his claim to the estate. Morrison set down the papers and fixed Grace with a steady stare. Are you telling me that Marcus Vance knew about your existence before the inheritance case went to court? I'm telling you that Marcus Vance orchestrated the entire fraud, specifically to prevent me from claiming my rightful inheritance. He couldn't take the risk that I might surface someday with a legitimate claim, so he made sure the false will was ironclad and that any evidence of my existence was buried as deeply as possible. The implications hit Caleb like a physical blow. His brother hadn't just been greedy, he'd been actively malicious, willing to destroy Caleb's life to protect a secret that could have brought them together instead of tearing them apart. All those years of bitter legal battles, all the family relationships destroyed, all the financial and emotional devastation, it had all been orchestrated by the brother he'd once trusted above anyone else in the world. But why come forward now? Caleb asked. You could have claimed the inheritance yourself, taken everything Marcus stole. Why involve me? Grace smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her expression carried genuine warmth. Because Jeremiah's will doesn't just leave us an inheritance, Caleb, it leaves us an explanation. She reached into her coat again and produced a thick letter, sealed with wax and bearing Jeremiah's distinctive handwriting. This was in the safe deposit box along with the will. Instructions to open it only if both of his sister's children could be located and brought together. With shaking hands, Caleb broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Jeremiah's familiar handwriting filled 3 pages of heavy paper, but it was the first paragraph that took his breath away. To my nephew Caleb and my niece Grace, if you are reading this together, then the secrets our family has carried for too long have finally come to light. Your mother Sarah was not just my sister, she was my closest friend and confidant. And before she died, she made me promise to look after both of her children. Even the one she'd been forced to give away before you, Caleb, were ever born. The letter went on to detail Jeremiah's knowledge of Grace's birth, his attempts to locate her through the years, and his decision to structure his will in a way that would eventually bring the siblings together. He'd known that Marcus was capable of dishonesty, had suspected it for years, and had deliberately created a situation that would expose his nephew's true character while protecting the inheritance. For those who truly deserved it, he knew, Caleb said quietly. Uncle Jeremiah knew about you all along. He was protecting both of us. And now we have a choice, Grace said, gathering up the documents. We can pursue legal action against Marcus, reclaim what's rightfully ours, and expose his fraud to the entire valley. Or we can find another way to handle this, a way that might preserve what's left of our family while still achieving justice. Morrison stood up from the table, his expression thoughtful. I'll need to take statements from both of you, and we'll have to involve the district attorney's office in any prosecution of the fraud charges. But I have to ask, what's your preference for how this gets handled? Grace looked at Caleb, her brown eyes, so similar to his own, filled with a question that went deeper than legal strategies or financial settlements. She was asking whether he wanted a sister, whether he was willing to build a relationship that could heal some of the wounds their family had inflicted on itself over the years. I think, Caleb said slowly, that it's time this family learned how to do the right thing for once. 3 hours later, Caleb and Grace sat across from each other in Morrison's office while the sheriff made phone calls that would set the wheels of justice in motion. The district attorney was interested, Morrison reported, very interested in a fraud case involving forged wills and stolen inheritances. There would be investigations, grand jury proceedings, and quite possibly criminal charges that could send Marcus to prison for a very long time. But as they waited for the legal machinery to begin grinding, Grace pulled out one more document that changed everything Caleb thought he understood about his family. "There's something else you need to see," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made Morrison pause his phone call and pay attention. "Something I found in Jeremiah's papers that I didn't show you earlier, because I wasn't sure how you'd react to it." The document she handed him was a medical report dated 1987, signed by a doctor Caleb had never heard of. As he read through the clinical language, his understanding of his own life shifted once again, this time in ways that made everything that had come before seem like simple preparation for this moment. "Genetic counseling report," he read aloud. "Patient, Robert Vance. Condition, Huntington's disease, early stage. Prognosis, progressive deterioration over 15-20 years. Genetic testing indicates 50% probability of transmission to biological children." Caleb looked up at Grace, his mind struggling to process what he was reading. "My father had Huntington's disease." "Not just had it," Grace said quietly. "He knew he had it from the time you were 12 years old. He knew he would deteriorate mentally and physically, and he knew there was a 50% chance he'd passed it on to you." The report included genetic test results for both Caleb and Marcus, conducted when they were teenagers under the guise of routine physical examinations. Marcus had tested negative for the gene that causes Huntington's disease. Caleb had tested positive. The room seemed to spin around him as the implications sank in. His father had known that Caleb would develop the same devastating disease that had claimed his grandfather, the grandfather whose progressive dementia and violent outbursts had been explained away as the natural result of aging and disappointment. His father had known and had never said a word. "How long?" Caleb asked, his voice barely audible. Grace consulted another page in the medical file. "According to this, symptoms typically begin appearing between ages 40 and 55. You're 53 now, which means I might already be showing early symptoms and not know it," Caleb finished. "Memory problems, mood changes, difficulty making decisions. Christ, I thought the stress of the inheritance fight was making me forgetful and short-tempered." Morrison set down his phone and leaned forward across his desk. "Caleb, you need to see a doctor. Get current testing done. Medical science has advanced a lot since 1987. But Caleb was barely listening. His mind was racing backward through the past few years, cataloguing incidents that suddenly made terrible sense. The times he'd forgotten simple things, like where he'd parked his truck or whether he'd locked his cabin door. The sudden flashes of anger that seemed to come from nowhere, directed at people who didn't deserve his rage. The increasing difficulty he'd had following complex conversations or making simple decisions. "Marcus knew," he said, the realization hitting him like a sledgehammer. "Marcus knew I was going to get sick and he used it against me." Grace nodded grimly. "That's what I believe, yes. The timing of the forged will, the way he manipulated the inheritance case, his systematic campaign to isolate you from the rest of the family. It all makes sense if he knew you'd eventually become incapacitated and unable to fight back. But there's more," she continued, producing yet another document from her seemingly endless collection of family secrets. "Jeremiah knew about your father's condition too. He'd been quietly setting aside money for your medical care, making arrangements with specialists in Denver, even researching experimental treatments. His will doesn't just leave us an inheritance, it leaves us a comprehensive plan for managing your condition." The document was a detailed care plan, written in Jeremiah's careful handwriting, outlining everything from specialist appointments to experimental drug trials, to modifications that would need to be made to the cabin to accommodate progressive physical disabilities. At the bottom, in Uncle Jeremiah's unmistakable script, was a note that brought tears to Caleb's eyes. "Caleb, you are not your grandfather. You are not your father. This disease may be part of your future, but it does not define who you are or limit what you can accomplish with the time you have. I've made arrangements to ensure you receive the best possible care, and I pray that Grace will be there to help you navigate whatever challenges lie ahead. Grace reached across the table and took his hand, her grip strong and steady. I've spent the last 3 years not just looking for you, Caleb. I've been preparing for this moment, learning about Huntington's disease, researching treatment options, connecting with support groups. I know this is overwhelming, but you're not facing this alone. Morrison cleared his throat. This changes the legal situation considerably. If Marcus knew about Caleb's condition when he forged the will, it adds another layer to the fraud charges. He wasn't just stealing an inheritance. He was stealing medical care from a man who was going to need it. There's something else, Grace said, her voice taking on a harder edge. Something that suggests Marcus's deception goes even deeper than we thought. She produced a series of photographs, all showing Marcus meeting with various people in settings that looked like business meetings. The photos were clearly taken with a telephoto lens, the kind of surveillance work that professional investigators specialized in. I've been watching Marcus for the past 6 months, documenting his activities. These meetings are with executives from mining companies, real estate developers, and what appears to be some kind of pharmaceutical research firm. They're not just interested in the land Jeremiah left. They're interested in the mineral rights, the development potential, and something else that I'm still trying to understand. One of the photographs showed Marcus shaking, hands with the man in an expensive suit outside a building whose sign read, Henley, Pharmaceuticals. The name hit Caleb like a physical blow. Henley, he said. That was Grace's father's name. Thomas Henley. Thomas Henley's family, Grace said quietly. They didn't just turn their backs on me when I was born. They built a pharmaceutical empire that's now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They've been researching genetic diseases for decades, including Huntington's disease. The pieces of a much larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Marcus hadn't just stolen an inheritance, he'd been positioning himself to profit from Caleb's illness, to sell access to a genetic research subject who carried a disease that pharmaceutical companies were desperately trying to cure. They want to study you, Grace said, her voice filled with disgust. Marcus has been setting you up to be a research subject, probably without your knowledge or consent. The isolation, the legal troubles, the systematic destruction of your support network, it was all designed to make you desperate and vulnerable. Morrison stood up from his desk, his expression grim. We're not just talking about inheritance fraud anymore. If what you're suggesting is true, we're looking at conspiracy, human trafficking for medical research, and God knows what else. Caleb stared at the photographs, trying to process the idea that his own brother had been planning to sell him to medical researchers like a laboratory animal. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he'd experienced during the inheritance fight, deeper even than learning about his genetic condition. But underneath the shock and anger, something else was building, a determination that surprised him with its intensity. Marcus had counted on his progressive illness to make him weak and compliant. He'd assumed that Caleb would eventually become too confused and isolated to fight back against whatever plans were being made for his future. Marcus had miscalculated. Caleb might be facing a devastating disease, but he wasn't facing it alone anymore. He had a sister who'd spent years preparing to help him, an uncle who'd left him resources and protection, and a determination to ensure that his remaining healthy years were spent on his own terms. So what do we do about it? He asked, looking from Grace to Morrison and back again. Grace smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the cabin, the expression reached her eyes. We fight back, and we make sure Marcus learns that some people can't be bought, sold, or manipulated, no matter how sick they might become. The plan they developed over the next 2 days was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential consequences for Marcus. Grace had spent years learning to think like the investigators and lawyers who'd helped her uncover her family's secrets. and her strategic mind proved to be a perfect complement to Caleb's intimate knowledge of mountain terrain and local customs. They would give Marcus exactly what he thought he wanted: a broken, desperate Caleb ready to accept whatever deal was offered, while secretly documenting every aspect of the conspiracy that had been built around his illness. The significant artifact that made their plan possible was a recording device that Grace had acquired during her months of surveillance work. No bigger than a matchbook, it could capture conversations with crystal clarity while remaining completely hidden in a shirt pocket or jacket lining. More importantly, it transmitted everything it recorded to a backup device that Grace would monitor from a safe distance. "The key," Grace explained, as they sat around the cabin's small table, mapping out their strategy, "is to make Marcus believe he's finally won. He needs to think you're at your lowest point, that the Huntington symptoms are affecting your judgment, and that you're ready to sign whatever papers he puts in front of you." Sheriff Morrison, who had become an unofficial third member of their conspiracy, leaned forward across the table. "The district attorney is interested, but she needs more than just documentary evidence. She needs Marcus on tape admitting to the fraud, ideally with details about the pharmaceutical conspiracy." "How do we make that happen?" Caleb asked. "Marcus isn't stupid. He's not going to confess to crimes just because I ask him nicely." "No," Grace said, "but he might confess to crimes if he thinks you're too confused to understand what he's telling you, and if he believes he needs to explain the situation to his pharmaceutical partners." The plan they developed was risky and required precise timing. Grace would approach Marcus directly, claiming to be a pharmaceutical researcher who'd learned about Caleb's condition through medical databases. She would pose as someone willing to pay substantial sums for access to a research subject with early-stage Huntington's disease, particularly one with detailed family medical history. Meanwhile, Caleb would begin showing up in public places around town, acting confused and disoriented in ways that would quickly reach Marcus through the small-town gossip network. He would appear to be having difficulty with simple tasks, forgetting people's names, showing the kind of cognitive decline that would make Marcus confident that his brother was becoming an easy target. "The beautiful thing about this approach," Grace explained, "is that Marcus will want to move quickly once he believes you're showing symptoms. He'll be worried that if your condition progresses too far, you'll be less valuable as a research subject." Morrison nodded his approval. "And if he's been working with pharmaceutical companies, he'll want to get you signed up for their research protocols before any other organizations learn about your condition. Competition for genetic research subjects is fierce. Over the next week, they put their plan into motion with the kind of careful precision that would have made Uncle Jeremiah proud." Grace established her cover identity as Dr. Helena Walsh, a researcher with Henley Pharmaceuticals who specialized in genetic disorders. She had business cards, a professional website, and even a rental car with Colorado Research Facility license plates. Caleb, meanwhile, began his performance as a man losing his grip on reality. He showed up at the local grocery store, asking for directions to places he'd known his entire life. He forgot the name of the clerk at the hardware store, a man he'd known for 20 years. He stood in the middle of Main Street for 5 minutes, looking around in apparent confusion before asking a passing teenager how to get to the post office that was clearly visible 50 yards away. The performance was harder than he'd expected, not because acting confused was difficult, but because some of the behaviors he was mimicking felt uncomfortably familiar. There had been times in recent months when he genuinely had felt disoriented, when familiar places had seemed strange and simple, tasks had become unexpectedly challenging. The line between acting and reality was thin enough to make him wonder whether his symptoms were more advanced than he'd realized, or whether the stress of recent events had simply made normal forgetfulness seem more ominous. Either way, the townspeople who witnessed his apparent decline reacted with the kind of concerned gossip that would inevitably reach Marcus within days. Grace's approach to Marcus was more direct. She called his office and requested a meeting to discuss research opportunities involving genetic conditions that run in local families. She was careful not to mention Caleb by name, but she provided enough details about her supposed research interests to make it clear she was talking about Huntington's disease. Marcus agreed to meet her at his office on Friday afternoon, a choice that suggested he was taking her inquiry seriously. Grace spent Thursday evening reviewing her cover story and testing her recording equipment, while Caleb practiced the kind of slightly confused, overly trusting demeanor that would make Marcus feel confident about manipulating him. "Remember," Grace told him as they made final preparations, "Marcus has been planning this for years. He's going to have documents ready, legal papers that look legitimate, maybe even a team of people who'll pose as medical researchers. The key is to let him think. You're signing whatever he puts in front of you, while actually signing nothing that could be legally binding." Morrison had provided them with blank legal forms that looked official but contained subtle language that would make any agreements invalid in court. The forms were printed on legal stationery and formatted to look like legitimate research consent documents, but they were carefully worded to protect Caleb while giving Marcus the impression that he was getting what he wanted. Friday morning arrived grey and cold, with snow clouds building over the mountains in a way that reminded Caleb of the day his mother had died. He'd been 12 then, too young to understand the full implications of losing the one person in his family who'd always believed in him. Now, at 53 and facing the possibility of a degenerative disease that would eventually rob him of his mind, he found himself thinking about the choices his mother had made during her brief life. She'd faced impossible circumstances when she was 17, pregnant, alone, with no support from either her family or Thomas Henley's family. But she'd found a way to survive, to protect her daughter, even when it meant giving her up, and to build a life that had meaning and dignity despite the secrets she'd been forced to carry. As he prepared to face his brother in what would likely be their final confrontation, Caleb drew strength from his mother's memory, and from the knowledge that Grace, the daughter Sarah had sacrificed so much to protect, was now standing beside him as an ally and advocate. The recording device felt warm against his chest, a technological talisman that represented not just the possibility of justice, but the proof that he wasn't facing this challenge alone. Grace would be listening to every word, monitoring every detail, ready to intervene if Marcus became suspicious or if the situation became dangerous. But more than that, she would be bearing witness to whatever truths emerged during the confrontation. After years of feeling isolated and abandoned by his family, Caleb finally had someone who understood not just his current situation, but the history that had shaped it. Grace knew their mother's story, Uncle Jeremiah's intentions, and the web of deceptions that Marcus had constructed over the years. She also knew, in ways that Marcus couldn't possibly understand, that some bonds between people can't be broken by distance, time, or even decades of separation. The sister who'd been taken from their family as a baby had returned as a woman capable of protecting the brother she'd never known she had. As Caleb drove down the mountain toward town, toward the confrontation that would either expose Marcus's crimes or destroy what remained of Caleb's life, he carried with him the weight of his mother's Bible, the warmth of his sister's loyalty, and the hope that Uncle Jeremiah's final gift to his family would be the truth that set them all free. Marcus's law office occupied the second floor of the nicest building on Main Street, with windows that looked out over the valley where they'd grown up together. Caleb sat in the waiting room, fidgeting with his hat and occasionally looking around with the kind of mild confusion he'd been practicing for the past week. The receptionist, a young woman he didn't recognize, watched him with the mixture of pity and unease that people show around those whose minds aren't quite right. At exactly 3 o'clock, Marcus emerged from his inner office with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a handshake that felt like a business transaction. He was dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Caleb had spent on clothes in the past 5 years. His hair professionally styled and his manner polished in the way that comes from years of practicing law in a small town where reputation is everything. "Caleb," Marcus said, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned, brotherly affection. "I'm so glad you agreed to meet with me. I know things have been difficult between us, but family is family, especially when someone's facing health challenges." The words were carefully chosen, Caleb realized. Marcus was establishing a record of concern and compassion while simultaneously confirming that he knew about the Huntington's disease. It was exactly the kind of calculated performance that Grace had predicted. "I've been having some troubles lately," Caleb said, allowing his voice to carry a slight tremor of uncertainty. "Forgetting things, getting confused about where I am sometimes. Doc says it might be something serious." Marcus's expression shifted into what looked like genuine sympathy, but Caleb could see the calculation behind his brother's eyes. "I've heard about some of the difficulties you've been having around town. That must be very frightening for you." "It is," Caleb admitted, and for a moment the emotion in his voice was entirely real. "I keep thinking about Grandpa, how he got near the end. Don't want to end up like that, Marcus. Don't want to be a burden on anybody." "You won't be," Marcus said quickly, guiding Caleb toward his private office. "That's actually why I wanted to talk with you today. There are options available now, medical research programs that can help people with genetic conditions like yours. Programs that can provide excellent care while also contributing to important scientific work." The office was larger than Caleb had expected, with leather furniture and expensive artwork that spoke of success and prosperity. On the desk was a stack of documents that looked like they'd been prepared in advance, along with a small digital recorder that Marcus made no attempt to hide. "I hope you don't mind," Marcus said, gesturing to the recorder. "For legal purposes, it's important to have clear documentation of any agreements we reach. Just to protect both of us." Caleb nodded as if the request made perfect sense, though he was actually pleased that Marcus wanted to record their conversation. It would make Grace's hidden surveillance even more valuable if they had Marcus's own recordings to compare with their version of events. A knock on the office door interrupted them before Marcus could begin his presentation. "Come in," Marcus called, and Grace entered the room in her role as Dr. Helena Walsh, carrying a professional-looking briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that medical researchers perfected during years of grant applications and peer review. "Mr. Vance," she said to Marcus, "thank you for arranging this meeting on such short notice." She turned to Caleb with the detached interest of a scientist examining a research specimen. "And you must be the patient we've been discussing." The word patient hit Caleb exactly the way Grace had intended. It reduced him from a person to a medical condition, from a brother to a research opportunity. Marcus's reaction was equally telling. His expression brightened with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from seeing a profitable deal falling into place. "Dr. Walsh, please sit down," Marcus said, gesturing to a chair beside Caleb. "I think this arrangement is going to work out very well for everyone involved." Grace opened her briefcase and pulled out a series of official-looking documents. "I've reviewed the preliminary medical information you provided, and Mr. Vance appears to be an excellent candidate for our research protocol. Early-stage Huntington's disease, detailed family medical history, and most importantly, no significant support network that might complicate his participation in our studies." The casual cruelty of that last observation made Caleb's jaw clench, but he forced himself to maintain his confused, trusting expression. Grace was painting a picture of him as isolated and vulnerable. Exactly what Marcus needed to hear to feel confident about proceeding. "The compensation structure is quite generous," Grace continued, spreading documents across Marcus's desk. $50,000 upon enrollment, with monthly payments of $5,000 for as long as Mr. Vance remains in the study. All medical care provided at no cost, of course, along with residential accommodation at our facility in Denver. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "And the length of the study?" Indefinite, Grace said with clinical precision. Huntington's disease provides unique research opportunities that extend throughout the progression of the condition. We found that our most valuable subjects are those who enter the study early and remain with us until the research is complete. The euphemistic language sent a chill down Caleb's spine. They were talking about the rest of his life, however much of it remained, as if it were a commodity to be purchased and consumed. Marcus pulled out his own set of documents, clearly prepared in advance for this meeting. "I've taken the liberty of drafting the necessary legal papers," he said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who believed he was in complete control of the situation. "Power of attorney documents, medical consent forms, and a property transfer agreement that will ensure Caleb's cabin and any other assets are properly managed during his participation in the research." Caleb forced himself to look confused and overwhelmed as he examined the papers. Though he was actually noting the sophisticated nature of the fraud Marcus had prepared. These weren't hastily written documents. They were professional legal instruments that had obviously taken weeks to prepare. Every contingency had been anticipated, every loophole closed, every aspect of Caleb's life carefully signed away. "This seems like a lot of paperwork," Caleb said, allowing his voice to shake slightly. "Maybe I should have a lawyer look at this first." Marcus and Grace exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their coordination. "I understand your caution," Marcus said, "but Dr. Walsh's research program has very limited enrollment slots. If we don't move quickly, the opportunity might go to someone else." "And frankly," Grace added, her voice carrying the clinical detachment she'd been maintaining throughout the meeting, "given the progression of your symptoms, waiting too long might make you ineligible for the program. We need subjects who can still provide informed consent." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. "Sign now, while you're still legally competent, or lose the chance forever." It was psychological pressure designed to force a quick decision from someone who was supposedly struggling with cognitive decline. But it was also the opening Caleb had been waiting for. "Marcus," he said, his voice taking on the pleading tone of someone who desperately needed help, "I trust you to look out for me. You've always been the smart one in the family, the one who understood legal things. If you think this is the right choice—" Marcus's expression softened with what looked like genuine brotherly concern, but Caleb could see the calculation behind his eyes. This was the moment Marcus had been working toward for years, his older brother, confused and desperate, ready to sign away everything without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. "I do think it's the right choice," Marcus said, reaching across the desk to squeeze Caleb's shoulder in a gesture that would look compassionate to anyone who didn't know the full context. "This research program will take care of you better than anyone else could. You'll have the best medical care available, and you'll be contributing to research that might help other families facing the same challenges. And the financial arrangements," Grace interjected, "will ensure that you never have to worry about money again. All your needs will be provided for." What she didn't mention, Caleb noticed, was that the financial arrangements would also ensure that he never had access to independent resources that might allow him to leave the program or seek outside help. The monthly payments Marcus had negotiated weren't compensation. They were chains disguised as gifts. "There is one small complication we need to address," Grace continued, pulling another document from her briefcase. "Our background research indicates that Mr. Vance may have a sister who could potentially contest these arrangements if she were to surface. We'll need documentation that no such sister exists, or if she does exist, that she has no legal standing to interfere with his medical care decisions." Marcus's reaction was perfect, a moment of surprise that was quickly covered by professional composure. "A sister? Caleb doesn't have any sisters. Our parents only had 2 children. According to our genealogical research, there are some irregularities in the family records that suggest otherwise," Grace pressed. "Birth records from the 1960s, adoption documentation, that sort of thing. Nothing definitive, but enough to raise questions if someone wanted to challenge our research agreements. I can assure you that no such person exists, Marcus said firmly. And even if she did, she would have no legal standing to interfere with Caleb's medical decisions. I'm his closest living relative and the executor of our family's estate. It was exactly the kind of definitive statement Grace had been hoping for, and Caleb could see her satisfaction in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. Marcus was on record denying Grace's existence while simultaneously claiming legal authority over Caleb's life. Authority that would be meaningless if Grace could prove her relationship to the family. In that case, Grace said, I think we can proceed with the enrollment process. Mr. Vance, are you ready to sign these documents and begin your participation in our research program? Caleb picked up the pen Marcus offered him, his hand trembling slightly with what could have been nerves or early symptoms of Huntington's disease. As he moved the pen toward the first document, he looked up at his brother with an expression of complete trust and gratitude. Thank you, Marcus, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I don't know what I would have done without you looking out for me. The words were true in ways that Marcus couldn't possibly understand. Because Marcus had been looking out for him, just not in the way their parents had intended when they taught their children that family always comes first. But instead of signing the documents, Caleb set the pen down gently and looked up at his brother with clear, steady eyes that held none of the confusion he'd been feigning for the past week. Actually, Marcus, he said, his voice strong and certain, I think there are a few things we need to discuss first. Starting with why you've been lying to me about Grace. The transformation in Marcus's expression was immediate and complete. Confusion gave way to shock, then to the kind of cold calculation that comes when a carefully planned deception suddenly collapses. Grace, meanwhile, dropped her clinical detachment and smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since entering the office. Hello, Marcus, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. I'm Grace Henley, your sister. The one you just claimed doesn't exist. Marcus's face went white as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He'd been recorded denying Grace's existence while simultaneously trying to commit her brother to a medical research program that would essentially imprison him for life. The legal implications were staggering, but the personal betrayal was even worse. You set me up, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You set yourself up, Caleb replied. We just gave you the rope. Sheriff Morrison chose that moment to enter the office, followed by Deputy Hayes and a woman Caleb didn't recognize, who introduced herself as District Attorney Patricia Chang. They'd been listening from the outer office, monitoring the conversation through Grace's hidden transmitter. Marcus Vance, D.A. Chang said, her voice carrying the formal authority of the state. You're under arrest for inheritance fraud, conspiracy to commit medical kidnapping, and violation of informed consent laws. You have the right to remain attorney present, which, given your profession, I assume you'll want to exercise. As Hayes cuffed Marcus and read him his rights, the district attorney turned to Grace. Dr. Walsh, I presume. Or should I say, Miss Henley? Your performance was quite convincing, though I hope you understand that impersonating a medical researcher carries its own legal complications. Grace smiled. I'll accept whatever consequences come from my actions, but I think you'll find that every document I presented to Marcus was clearly marked as a simulation for educational purposes, if you examine the fine print. I never actually claimed to be affiliated with any real research institution. It was a clever legal maneuver that protected Grace while still allowing Marcus to incriminate himself. The DA nodded with what looked like professional appreciation for a well-executed plan. As they led Marcus away, he stopped at the office door and looked back at Caleb with something that might have been regret or might have been anger. You don't understand, he said. The Huntington's disease, you're going to need help. Real help. I was trying to ensure you got proper care by selling me to medical researchers who wanted to study me until I died. Caleb asked. By forging Uncle Jeremiah's will and stealing the inheritance he left to take care of me? That's your idea of brotherly love? Marcus had no answer for that. As the door closed behind him, Caleb felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The brother who'd betrayed him was gone, but the sister he'd never known he had was standing beside him, and that felt like a fair trade. 3 months later, Caleb stood on the porch of the cabin where his mother had given birth to Grace 60 years earlier, watching the first snow of winter dust the pine trees with white. The cabin had been transformed over the summer. New roof, modern plumbing, a generator that provided reliable electricity, and medical equipment that would help him monitor his condition as the Huntington's disease progressed. Grace lived in a small house she'd built on the property, close enough to help when he needed it, but far enough away to give them both privacy and independence. She'd resigned from her job in Denver and used part of the inheritance, Uncle Jeremiah's real inheritance, restored to them after Marcus's conviction, to establish a foundation that provided support for families dealing with genetic diseases. The carved wooden rattle that had started this whole journey sat on the mantelpiece above the stone hearth, a reminder of the mother who'd made impossible choices with courage and love. Next to it was Uncle Jeremiah's final letter, framed and positioned where Caleb could see it every morning when he woke up. His symptoms were advancing slowly but steadily. Some days he forgot simple things, lost track of conversations, or found familiar tasks inexplicably difficult. But he was facing the progression with medical support, family love, and a sense of purpose he'd never expected to find. Grace had connected him with researchers who were working on actual treatments rather than just studying the disease's progression. He'd enrolled in a legitimate clinical trial that might slow his symptoms, and if it didn't help him, the data might help other families in the future. Marcus had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for the inheritance fraud and conspiracy charges. The sentence was lighter than Caleb had hoped, but the public exposure of his crimes had been devastating enough. The Whitman family had distanced themselves from their disgraced son-in-law, and Marcus's law practice had collapsed under the weight of scandal and civil lawsuits. Most importantly, Grace had used her connections in the pharmaceutical industry to expose the research program that had tried to exploit Caleb. Several executives faced criminal charges, and new regulations were being developed to protect vulnerable research subjects from similar schemes. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the cabin in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of his mother's voice reading to him from her Bible, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace with his place in the world. He wasn't the man he'd planned to become when he was young. The disease would eventually take his mind, just as it had taken his grandfather's and his father's. But he would face that future surrounded by love instead of alone, with purpose instead of despair, and with the knowledge that some families, even broken ones, could be healed if people were willing to fight for each other. Grace called from her kitchen that dinner was ready, her voice carrying across the mountain air with the same gentle authority their mothers had possessed. As Caleb walked toward the house, he carried with him the weight of his mother's Bible, the warmth of his sister's love, and the hope that Uncle Jeremiah's faith in family had been justified at last.